Splish, splishity splash, 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 splash. Shut up, dogs. Dogs, what are you doing? Hey, yeah, it's been a while since I made a tutorial, so I thought I'd make one because I want to... dog. So I wanted to do some waves on the beach. So as I primarily use Corona renderer, I saw in their development plan that they're going to support Phoenix FD, so I got really excited about that. So I'm trying Phoenix FD at the moment. And then I was, obviously like a few other people, I was surprised to find out that they don't support the particles within Phoenix FD, so decided to try and make a workaround and see how I can get that into Corona. And came up with a couple of methods. One of them's pretty scene intensive, so it takes a while to render, but it comes up with some pretty good results. There's a couple other methods that I came up with as well, just to sort of speed up render time so you can put more passes into it. But anyway, just for a laugh, I thought I'd show you the way I started out. What I thought that I could do is, I'll take my my simulation and set it up in Corona, make it all look nice, and then once I'm happy with my lighting, I'll set up a scene with the scanline renderer and I'll try and match the lighting as closely as I could with a just a skylight and a directional light, just to get that sun, sort of mimic the sun a little bit. So then I went into Corona and I rendered out a nice pass of just the water in the Corona setup. Then I in the scanline I rendered a pass of the splashes, the foam, and then the reflection of the splashes. So this was my mindset at the time. So then what I did was, so I took the Corona pass, put the splashes on top of that, put the foam in, then put the reflection in, and basically just tweaked a few settings until I, got it to look as good as I could. And I quickly realized that it's just a shit method. It's just not gonna cut it. It's just, there's so many things you lose. Like the splashes make shadows within themselves. They make themselves look a certain way. They cast shadows on themselves. They cast shadows on the foam. They get shadows from the water. Same with the foam. Same with basically everything. The foam will cast shadows, through the water, that will refract through the water and cast shadows onto the sand underneath it. And I soon realized that it's just it'll come up with a passable method, but it's not going to be good enough. Like you have to render everything within Corona because you get all the nice shadows, refraction, the reflected light, all that sort of good stuff that you put on the splashes and the foam. So what I originally wanted to do was I wanted to export my fluid, and then I wanted to export my particles. And I looked on some documents and found that you can also export it to a limbic format. So if I click on my grid, go down to export, if you click on mesh, in preview, make sure that show mesh is on, and then if you just go to basically where is export selected, and just export that, and what that'll do is it'll export your mesh as an limbic format. But they reckon also here, apparently you can do it with particles as well. But for some reason, every time I tried to export for particles, it just didn't work. I'm not sure why. It just didn't work. So anyway, so once you export that the fluid as an limbic format, you can basically hide the liquid and then load back in your limbic format fluid. And now what we want to do is we want to get the splashes and the foam in a similar sort of way that we did with limbic, but because we can't use, because I don't know whether it was because of Max 2017, they've updated it now, well, but I just couldn't do it. So one thing that's amazing is TyFlow, which you can download for free. It's a beta version at the moment, and this is great because within TyFlow, it's got things here like birth fluid, fluid force, fluid properties, and they all work with Phoenix FD. So what you can do is you can do a birth fluid, and then you can pick your Phoenix FD fluid object as your birth. So now it's going to birth particles within any property in the Phoenix FD simulation. So I can just turn all this stuff off now because I don't need all that. And see down here you can select which properties you want to birth particles from. So I'm just going to start off with the splashes. And you can see automatically it just starts birthing particles on the splashes, which is exactly what we want. One thing to note is this new only. So you want to make sure that's ticked, because what that does is it births particles on every particle ID, and if you don't tick new only, it's gonna for every frame it's gonna birth particles on every single one. So as you move forward, it's just gonna double. It's gonna like make clones of every frame. Every time you've got a particle on that frame, it's gonna birth one no matter what, like regardless of if it's the same ID or not. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that if one particle spawns and it's ID 1, if the next frame particle 1 still exists, what happens is it's not going to birth another particle for ID 1 because it's already birthed one. So so you want to make sure you tick new only, so when new particles are introduced, it will birth another particle on that frame. But one thing you want to do is, for splashes, we've got a lot of splashes that have birthed with the simulator. So we just want to turn the percentage down just so we can work with it for now. And then what will happen is, as the frames move, so as I move forward, you'll see I start moving forward, you'll notice that some of the frames, they get left behind. It's like they're birthing with the simulation, but they're not moving with the simulation. So what we want to do there is we want to add this fluid force. So chuck that underneath, and now we can do fluid. We can select the same fluid sim. Just leave all these alone. They work fine. And then we want to go down to the fluid particles and click splashes, because that's the one where the force we want to follow. So now that we've clicked the fluid force to follow splashes, we've birthed them on the splashes, we're following it. So now as you go through, the particles will follow the fluid force of the splashes, and that's basically it. So now we've got particles where the splashes are that we can render in Corona because we're using TyFlow. So now it's basically up to your imagination now. So you can make the particles look however you want. So I can go into, if I change this to geometry and give it a shape of maybe, let's say, a 3D geosphere. Now if you look in here, you can see now that we've got spheres everywhere that the splash is supposed to be. So you can change that now to, you can go to scale, you can make everything a bit bigger, give it a bit of variation, and now you've got, you can do whatever you want. You can use an instant shape for the splashes, but I'll show you what I did, just because I felt like it worked for me. One thing to note is with TyFlow, if you want to render it, you have to add a mesh. Just add that mesh one, and now it will render out. But what I did, just to save some polygons and stuff like that, I went into shape and I want to set, so I'll just pick a plane, just a low res plane, and then now I've got if I go to wireframe, you can see I've got all these facing planes, and I want them to face the camera. So I haven't used TyFlow a lot, but I found the easiest way to do that was to go, where is it? Add a rotation, and then choose, instead of random 3D, do object align, and then go down to object and pick the camera, and then it'll face the camera, but it's the wrong axis. So I just went in here and changed the axis by 90 degrees. That could be the wrong one. There we go. So now everything's facing, it's facing the camera. going to add a texture, created a new corona material, and I just set that to 100% white. I didn't change anything else. And now what I want to do is, so when I add, if I add this to TyFlow, it's going to assign this material to every face. But what I want to do is I want to sort of give it like a circular fall off, or like a fluff sort of effect, so it looks more like a splash, and they'll all blend together like a lot of little circles. So you can just go to gradient, add a gradient route, just remove this, delete that one, and now you want to change it to a radial shape, and you want to invert this mask, so you can either go and invert it, or I just quickly change the colors. And now we've got the little sort of, you know, soft ball, soft sphere look, and we can just chuck that in the opacity channel. And now, if you give it a quick render, so now you can see as it starts to compute, you can see that it's sort of all the little spheres sort of connect together to make this nice little shape of more like a splash. But it's obviously everything's so dense that the shadows it's making are so dark that it's not going to look right. So I'll just cancel the render and go into the material, and instead of having it completely transparent, you can just go in here and make it less so everything will be less transparent, and then you can just give that a render again, see what it looks like. Alright, so you can see it's getting a little bit better, but it's not perfect, so you just have to tweak the settings around. But anyway, so that's in a nutshell. You can add any particle you want to the splashes in Phoenix FD and then render with Corona. So you just do the same thing that you did with TyFlow for the splashes, but you do the same thing. You just make a new one, and instead of birthing it from the splashes, you birth it from the foam. You know, the fluid force, you have to pick. If you make the foam one, you have to obviously follow the foam, and then you just pick the foam shape you want, which I just did the same shape for the foam. So if I hide this one and show you the ones I made, and that's all I did. When you render that, and that'll look like this. And you know, it looks, I think it looks pretty good, and I was quite happy with it. The only problem is that having that render a texture or a material on every single particle, mind you, this is not even 100% particles for foam or splash, because it just took way too long. So it's not ideal, because let's just say for this example, every frame you see is only 4 passes, and that took about maybe 14 to 15 minutes, so each frame. So all up it took about, you know, it only goes for about 4 seconds. It took about 22 hours or so just to render that little bit of footage, and it's only 4 passes, which is not very high at all. So so what I thought I'd do is I would try and come up with another way. Like, even though it looks really good, and you know, if you got a week to render, or you set it to a render farm, it's going to be great. But I thought I would try and come up with another method that would render a lot quicker and sort of look similar to this. And the way I sort of thought about it was, I thought, well, see this how the liquid comes in, and you're able to export that as a limbic format, bring it back in, render it, and it's perfect. It just, you know, you don't have to worry about it. You know that that's exactly where the fluid's going to be. That's the mesh. I thought, wouldn't it be great if instead of having alright, so what I thought was, because the reason this is slowing down and taking so long to render is because there's so many of these particles, but you have to keep that many particles, but because you need these particles to be dense. For example, if I go to the foam, so the foam down here, and if I change the percentage to say like, you know, 5%, you notice that it just doesn't, like, it's going to lose all this detail. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to separate the particles and, you know, sort of make a mesh around the particles that work the same way or a similar way that the fluid works, as in, you know, the fluid's made up of all these particles, but then it creates a mesh. So I thought, well, why don't we create a mesh from these particles so that therefore we can still have it really, like, we can still have the density that we need, so we can make it all the big giant build up of here. But instead of getting the big giant build up with a million little particles, we can just have one big mesh that covers it, and then we can just chuck a volumetric material on it to give it the appearance of like a splash or something. So the good thing about TyFlow is that it also has a Ty mesher, which is similar to blob mesh, but it's like 100 times faster. So I'll grab the Ty mesher and I'll go to pick, and I will pick the TyFlow particles for the splash. And now you can see in here, if I hide the TyFlow particles, you can see that the Ty mesher is doing exactly what we need. So it's keeping the bulk of the shape of where the particles are, but where it's really dense, it's actually not that dense anymore. You can see it's just a simple mesh. So now we can chuck a volumetric material on this, and it will render, you know, 10 times faster than the other method. So now all we do is go into the Ty mesh settings, and we can change the voxel size down, and now we'll start increasing the radius. And what that'll do is we'll start to, you know, flesh it out a bit more, so we can see it a bit more, maybe give it some variation. And now we've got, it's more of a sort of, I guess it's more of a foamy look, I guess, that you can have to the splash, especially down around here, because these are halfway under the sand. These will actually look like, you know, foam bubbles that actually sort of build up around the edge, which is actually pretty cool. And you can smooth it out a bit, so you can give it some filtering, and that'll just smooth it out. So now all we have to do is go into your material editor, and give it a volumetric material. So you can just go Corona volume and apply that to the Ty mesher, and now you'll see that you've got the volumetric material. And then you just go into the settings, so maybe just adjust the distance so that, you know, maybe it takes about, you know, 4 centimeters before it starts to show the color. This is what the scattering color, that's what it's going to show, so you want that to be white. And also, if you change this to completely black, it seems to work a lot better. And I'm not too sure what this does, but I just checked that to inside volume. And now what happens if we render, you can see that it's a hell of a lot quicker. And so now it gives you nice, it's similar to what we had before, but it looks more foamy, sort of like more splashy, more foamy, and it's so much quicker. Alright, so there's a few other things that you might be wondering as well. So Corona's not going to render it out with motion blur. So one way around this is to bring it into After Effects, and there's actually a nice little setting in here. So if I type in motion blur, this little one in After Effects called Force Motion Blur, if I chuck that onto my scene, just keep default settings for now, enable this frame blend, turn it on to not so off draft mode, so it's on good, and then enable it up here as well. And you can see here with the footage, see how it's all sort of blurred itself out. So now if I go to another frame, you can see it looks nice and smooth. And if that's too intense for you, you can just turn down the angle to maybe 120. But I found for simple shots like this, this motion blur effect works fine. Like it looks really good. some more complicated scenes, obviously you're gonna have to find some other methods or other solutions. Like I've heard Real Smart Motion Blur is a good one, but you can see here this is actually for a simple scene. It's actually working out pretty nicely for some motion blur. And there's also another thing, which is the wet maps, and that's probably the easiest thing to export from Phoenix FD, because all you have to do is go to switch to scanline renderer and apply that wet map to the object's diffuse channel, set it to 100% self-illumination, and then render it to texture as an image sequence. And then all you have to do is bring that texture back in Max and set that to the blend material, so that you can, the wet to dry blending materials will use that sequence that you've rendered out. And I didn't actually include it in this one because I completely forgot about it, but I know that's going to work because I've tested it before. So anyway, thanks, I hope it's helpful, and I hope that one day, Corona may support these one day, but for now it doesn't really matter because we've got TyFlow to come and rescue us. So, thanks TyFlow. Woo!